Hi, I'm Meyer-Gutbrod. This talk is called Unusual Mortality Event Prompts Increased Legislation and Partisan Variation at State and Federal Levels. I'm talking on behalf of myself and my co-author team, which includes my grad students, Abby and Amedi from USC, University of South Carolina, and two new names to the right whale community. That's Laura Doughton, a recent graduate from USC, and my husband, Josh Meyer-Gutbrod, and both Laura and Josh are in the political science department. So most of us are scientists and managers. Thus, I have to answer the question, why bother studying legislative activity in the first place? We know that most right whale management activity goes through the bureaucracy, like goes through NOAA's rulemaking process. But U.S. Congress exercises control over NOAA by appropriating funding, first and foremost. Congress can enhance or limit NOAA's power. And Congress can also identify bureaucratic priorities, like it did when it passed the Inflation Reduction Act and dictated how NOAA would spend money towards right whale conservation and management. Another example of why legislative activity matters is in 2024, Chevron deference was overturned. So Chevron deference is referring to a court case in the 1980s, the NRDC versus Chevron. And the result of that case was essentially that U.S. agencies in the bureaucracy, like NOAA, would have the authority to interpret ambiguous laws. And now that this precedent was just overturned last year, there can be an increased need for legislative bodies at state and federal levels to write and pass more regulatory laws. An even more recent example is a few months ago, Alaskan Representative Begich introduced a draft bill that would gut the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So generally, we're hoping that this study of legislative activity will measure political mood and interest over space and time, and also help us identify legislators that could be potential allies for pushing forward right whale management and conservation. We're going to address 5 hypotheses in this talk. The first one is that the unusual mortality event in 2017 acted as what political scientists call a focusing event, and it opened up a policy window, triggering more bills to be written and introduced about right whales. The hypothesis 2 and 3 have to do with diffusion. So that's when bills or chunks of bills move between different legislative bodies. So we were looking for the reuse of text or the reuse of ideas between neighboring states in H2 or going from the state up to the federal level up to Congress in hypothesis 3. And then the final 2 hypotheses have to do with the type of policy that is proposed in a bill. And so hypothesis 4 is that states that are predominantly Democratic in party are more likely to introduce action-oriented policies, whereas Republican-led states are more likely to have signaling policies. They don't do any direct actions, but they communicate a position. Laura scraped and painstakingly read all bills containing the term right whale at the federal level starting in 1993 up until the end of last year, and then all state legislative websites containing all bills that have the word whale in it. And we focused on states on the Atlantic coast, and that time series starts in the year 2000 and ends at the end of 2024. The result of this analysis is a roughly even number of federal and state level bills introduced pertaining to right whales, so 49 bills at the federal level in Congress and 56 bills at state legislatures. Interestingly, there were only right whale bills introduced in 5 states: Maine, Massachusetts, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida. Most of these bills did not pass. So we did see an increase in legislation introduced at the federal level, shown in the top figure, and at the state level, shown in the bottom figure, starting in 2017. So this indicates that the UME did in fact act as a focusing event, and it opened up a policy window, just causing an increase in legislative activity. But I want to draw your attention to the larger increase in the federal level, so in Congress, starting in the 21-22 legislative session. And that seems to be mostly related to support for or opposition against the NOAA proposed vessel strike rule. So that seems to be acting like a nested focusing event within the UME. Now we're going to try to address our second and third hypotheses about policy diffusion. And we're going to start by looking at a few examples of federal bills. So on the left, we've got repeated text that was used in bills introduced by Cory Booker and Seth Moulton during consecutive legislative sessions. So you see 2017, 2019, and 2021 on there. And they kept trying to pass this policy that would essentially appropriate more funding towards research and management of right whales. But it's just these same two actors, Cory Booker and Seth Moulton, and they're showing perseverance. They keep trying with this bill, but that text is not diffusing to a different legislative body. On the right, we have sort of the opposite example. We've got some conservatives, Joe Manchin and Buddy Carter, and this is all occurring within the same legislative session. This is the 118th Congress, so around 2023. And they are workshopping text to try to stop NOAA's 2022 vessel speed rule from getting passed. And the text changes, but the idea is the same, which indicates they're trying to update the text and change it in a way that's going to actually make it stick so that the bill will pass. Now at the state level, here's a few examples of action-oriented bills that were introduced in Massachusetts. On the left, we see bills that try to appropriate funding for fishing gear, to have more whale-safe fishing gear researched and available. And on the right, we see repeated bills that try to require the passage of a management plan for wind energy, wind farms. We consider both of these to be action-oriented because they have a direct action. Here in Georgia, we see examples of right whale themed bills. And in the first set at the top, Georgian legislators are expressing support for tourism and voicing opposition to oil and gas exploration. So these are expressing opinions, but they don't have a direct action. Thus, we call them signaling bills instead of action-oriented. At the bottom, we see bills where the Georgia legislature urges the federal Congress to pass a certain bill or to appropriate funding to NIMS. So again, they're not taking up this role directly, they're passing on the role to a different legislative body at the federal level. So although we saw no examples of policy diffusion where bill text or bill ideas moved from one legislature to the next, H4 and H5, these hypotheses had really interesting results, where we found that Democrat-dominant state, Massachusetts in this case, introduced almost exclusively action-oriented policies, whereas our three Republican-dominated states, South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida, passed exclusively signaling policies, where they express opinions or urge a different legislative body to act. Then the wild card was the state of Maine, and we've seen switches in party dominance in Maine. Sometimes it's dominated by Republicans, and other times it's dominated by Democrats. And out of the 4 bills passed over the time series, we found half of those bills were action-oriented. It's where they try to appropriate funding for a whale disentanglement program. And the other 2 bills are signaling. One is sort of on the conservation side, recommending additions to the state-level endangered species list. And the other is sort of on the opposite side, which is urging NOAA to think about how TRT plans would impact Maine's lobster industry. I did want to remind you that state legislatures can really only exercise power in state waters, so that's usually 3 nautical miles from the coast. That's not very far, and there are not necessarily a lot of right whales sighted in state waters. So we mapped out state waters here on the left to show you just how narrow that band is. And on the right, we just summarized the number of right whale sightings within state waters, right, within that first 3 nautical miles. And so most sightings occur in federal waters outside of that 3 nautical mile line. But Massachusetts, of course, in Cape Cod Bay and around Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, they have a lot of right whale sightings, which is probably why Massachusetts led the game in terms of bills that were introduced at the state level. And the states that do not introduce bills in the Mid-Atlantic, New York Bight area, they don't see high numbers of right whales within state waters. So our takeaways are that the UME did act as an opportunity for state and federal legislatures to put more attention on right whale conservation issues. We found no evidence of policy diffusion, and we think that matters because it may signal that there's a missed opportunity for people like us, for NGOs, to have bill text drafted and then present it to legislatures and to staffers when an event occurs, like a UME. We also found that Democratic-led states tended to introduce action-oriented bills, whereas Republican-led states introduced more signaling bills. And, you might feel that action-oriented bills are more effective, more important, but I think the important point here is if you're going to approach a specific legislator, you want to approach them with the way that they operate. So if you're approaching a Republican, maybe having them pass some kind of signaling legislation is worth it. And then, of course, this helps us identify which legislators have been and will continue to be likely to take up right whale management issues. There's certainly more to do to understand the right whale issue from the social and political science fields in bureaucracy at the federal and state level, Canadian legislative efforts, lawsuits, court cases, NGO and industry activity, and of course news coverage, and work to pull all these pieces together and understand the big picture of how humans are approaching right whale management. Huge thanks to our co-authors, especially those in the political science department who explained most of these concepts to us, as well as our funding source, which is the USC Honors College supporting Laura when she did this analysis. And thanks to all of the staffers and interns at these various legislatures that make all of this data available. Please reach out if you have questions or you're interested in collaborating.